Don't forget to check out my new book, now available on Amazon.com, on Kindle, paperback, and hardcover. The link is on the description of this episode below. Enjoy the show. It's taken me years to finally share this and attempt to find others with a similar experience. But after talking with a friend, I figured this might help me out. The year was 2003, and I was visiting my family in Puerto Rico for the summer. I was 11 years old at the time, and I'm currently 24. I don't remember exactly what day it was, but it was shortly before the end of the vacation. As I recall, it was around the end of June, and like I said, the year was 2003. I was spending the night at my cousin's house, watching movies and playing board games. We had the front door wide open, with the screen door shut, so the air could get in through the house. It was around 1:30 in the morning. My cousins, my sister, and I were starting to get tired. My eldest cousin out of the two turned to me and asked me to go shut the front door. I begrudgingly obliged, and I headed to the door to shut it. The next minute of my life would change me forever. I was a skeptic. I didn't believe in anything paranormal, or the occult for that matter. Sasquatch, aliens, none of that. That is, until this encounter. As I went to close the door, I caught a whiff of something horrible. Actually, one of the worst smells that I've ever smelled in my entire life. And it was at that point that I decided to look up. You see, I was mad about having to close the door, and walked up staring at the ground, mumbling about it. When I looked up, I saw a large figure outside of the door. It was around 3 to 4 feet from the door, just off the porch. The porch was about a foot off the ground. This creature was taller than me. I was 4'9" at the time, and it was at least 2 to 3 inches taller than me, and that was when it was on all fours. Although, it looked as if it was capable of standing on its hind legs. The creature was grayish-green in color, with dark, thick hair covering most of its body. As the hair got closer to the crown of the head, it got thicker and more coarse. It was almost like porcupine quills, and came to a messy point. Its front limbs were skinny, almost the same size as mine, but much longer, with 3 fingers at the end. It had hind legs that were like a grown man, and slightly toned. From what I could see in that few seconds, its hind legs seemed to have 2 fingers, or toes. Its head was bulbous, and apart from the thick hair at the crown, was only covered with very thin, lightly colored hairs. Its mouth looked like a cross between a chimpanzee and a dog. I mean, its lips looked like a chimp, but the mouth came to a small point like a dog's do, and I could see 2 rather large fangs protruding from its mouth, which was slightly opened. The most haunting thing about this creature, though, were its large, oval-shaped eyes. They were about the size of large oranges, but they were an eclipse shape. They were this insane amber color, and shone like nothing I've ever seen. Yet, they seemed almost empty and dull at the same time. It's kind of hard to explain. I could hear it breathing. It was fairly soft, but also had this gurgling noise coming from it at the same time. I was frozen in fear for what seemed like forever. But it couldn't have been longer than a minute, because I remember my cousin saying that was fast when I got back over to them. Once I snapped back to reality, I slammed the door shut and locked it. At that moment, I ran off, and I could hear it start moving outside on the gravel of the lawn. I then heard the bushes rattle. I went straight to my cousins and sister, panicked, telling them what I saw. Of course, none of them believed me in the slightest, but they'd soon change their minds, because in the near future, they themselves would have similar experiences to mine, although with different entities nonetheless. As I stated before, up until I saw this creature, I was absolutely sure that nothing existed out there. In my mind, there were no cryptids, or aliens, or even ghosts or demons for that matter. Those things just didn't exist, and were bullshit to me. Then I had this encounter, no longer than a minute, and my whole life changed. I was now a believer. I've since gone on to encounter other things too, that I'll recount in future emails. My reason for sending you this one was to recount this experience and try to find others who've seen this creature, or creatures that at least bear striking resemblance to the one that I saw. I want to know just what the hell it was that I saw, and if anyone else has had an encounter as close as mine with the same type of entity, or at least one of its kind, because I strongly believe that there are more than one of these things out in the world. As I previously stated, I don't know what it was, but I often refer to it as a chupacabra, only for lack of a better creature to call it. I can't think of anything else, to my knowledge, that fits the bill of this creature. So, therefore, that's what I'll call it for now. A chupacabra. I really want to get in touch with others who've seen similar creatures, or maybe even seen the same creature, or the same species. Who knows? Maybe after this, I'll find someone who saw it that same night, although I think that would be a stretch. Anyways, thank you for your time. I currently live in central Illinois, but I was born and raised in New Jersey, the Pine Barrens. Growing up there, we had all heard stories of encounters with the Jersey Devil. My grandma had an encounter, along with my dad. Pretty much anyone who has ever lived there knows somebody who has claimed to have seen this creature. I even have a former boss who staged a prank on his friend that ended up getting reported as a Jersey Devil sighting back in the 70s. I'm not sure he ever even told his friend it was a prank, so it might even still be an official sighting in the books. Even after hearing all these stories growing up, I was never afraid to come across him. He was always portrayed as a shy, somewhat benign creature. He was never aggressive, and he was always visible enough for the person to just catch a glimpse of him. I always felt kind of sorry for him in a way. He always seemed to lead such a lonely existence. Anyway, I spent my childhood years riding around on my four-wheeler in his territory with no more fear of coming across the Jersey Devil than I would coming across a poorly concealed corpse jumped by the mob. Well, flash forward to my teen years. I'm working on a blueberry farm in Horton State Forest with my brother's girlfriend, Janice. She didn't have a driver's license at the time, so I usually ended up driving her back and forth to work every day. We usually worked well past dinner time, and this particular story took place in the early days of fall. That evening, I was dropping her off at her house. It was a few hours after sunset. The farm we worked on was pretty deep in the middle of nowhere, and the farm she lived on was even deeper in the middle of nowhere. To get to her house, we had to drive through some pretty thick forest on gravel roads with no streetlights. It would freak anyone out, I suppose, but I was used to driving through the dark woods, so it was never anything really that bothered me. I got Janice safely to her house, went inside, and exchanged some pleasantries with her parents, and then shortly made my way home. I was on the last stretch of road, before the main highway that would take me to the end of town. And that's when I was overcome with the creepiest feeling that I've ever had. I can't describe it any other way than I just felt like I was being watched. So, like the dum-dum I am, I stopped the car. My doors were locked, and I had a big wrench under my seat. I knew how to swing it to make it hurt if I needed to. After all, I still was in New Jersey. So I'm sitting there, scanning the road ahead of me, and can't really see anything other than the 30 to 40-year-old blueberry bushes on either side of the road. If you let blueberries grow, they'll climb to pretty much astonishing heights. With these tall bushes lining the road, I really couldn't see too far into the forest around me. After looking for a few seconds, I popped back into the car and popped back into gear. I slowly started pulling down the road again. That's when I noticed movement at the top of one of these tall bushes. I stopped the car again and immediately started watching in that direction. Once I focused my eyes, I could clearly see something very large crouching on the top of one of the blueberry bushes. I couldn't make out any details as far as colors or facial or body details, but it was something clearly silhouetted against the bright starry sky. What I could make out was something larger than a man with a huge head, sitting in a half-crouched position, almost like it was ready to spring from its hind legs. I sat and stared for what seemed like an eternity. I was baffled how something that big could sit on top of a blueberry bush like that. As I said before, These bushes were old and tall, but not very sturdy. They grow almost like a garden hedge, so if anything couldn't possibly be sitting on top of them without breaking the branches or tearing the bushes all to heck. In my concentration at staring at whatever was in the bushes, I accidentally let my foot slip from the clutch, and my car stalled the engine. Such a stupid move. I can honestly tell you I came very close to almost pooping my pants right then and there. This was the wrong move. Right there, in any horror movie, you don't let your car die in the middle of the woods with some creature stalking around you. Anyway, I think the sound of my car startled it, because this thing's head whipped around to stare right at me. Just as it took off in one swift motion and was gone from my sight. As it was taking off, I didn't exactly see any wings on its back, but I did hear loud whooshing noises like large wings would make. In addition to hearing this, I could make out some very powerful looking legs that were bent at the knees, just like a horse's legs would be. It used them, and what I assume were the wings on its back, to disappear from my sight in a second. Since the car was now stalled and quiet, I could hear a loud screech and a whoosh of air above me that grew fainter within seconds. This thing was fast, and it was powerful, whatever it was. I know I weirdly keep talking about these blueberry bushes, but I swear they're important to the story. As this creature was taking off from me, those bushes almost bent in half as this thing jumped off of them, and I sat there watching them thrash and sway for quite a few moments after that creature was gone. Whatever was up there was skilled enough to sit on there without breaking any branches, but still powerful enough to get them crashing around like crazy once it leapt off of them. Needless to say, I freaked the hell out, got the car started, threw it back into gear, and swung around the road headed back to the safety of Janice's house, all within moments of this thing screeching away from me. I must have looked like a crazy person when I showed up back at their house. I drove over the railway ties in their driveway, left my driver's side door open, and just barged into these people's house. I started babbling to Janice's dad about what I'd seen, and he calmly told me, "You must have seen the Jersey Devil." He drove me back to the spot where I'd seen it, and it confirmed there was definitely a disturbance in the bushes on the side of the road when he got out and looked himself. He told me he'd had quite a few sightings of the Jersey Devil on his land, but he'd never said anything to his wife or daughters so they wouldn't get freaked out. Needless to say, I let the cat out of the bag on that one, but he didn't really seem to care. I think he was just happy to have someone else bolster his own sightings on the land. I've never officially reported the sighting to date, but it did earn me a bit of a badge of courage among the locals for being dumb enough to stop and stare at a creature in the dark woods all by myself. Hi, Supernaturalist. My name is Dakota. I sent you a message on YouTube telling you that I had a Sasquatch and 2 Dogman encounters. I give my permission for you to use my name in the video if you wish, and that I live in Tennessee. However, I won't disclose the exact location. Here's my first encounter. This one was with a Sasquatch. When I was young, and in 8th grade, my family and I lived in a secluded area. Our driveway was a mile long, and our home was the only one out there. When you turned onto the driveway, you would travel through woods to get to our house, which was in this type of cul-de-sac. My mother often worked the 3rd shift, and I would have to see myself off to school. One morning, I got ready as usual, and walked out the front door and started my way up the driveway. As I was approaching a large tree that was on my left-hand side, I heard this loud crunching noise, like something very heavy was stepping on tree branches. I stopped dead in my tracks and looked to my left. I didn't see anything at first, but I was overwhelmed with a sense of fear, and my body seemed to be frozen in place. Then, this large creature stepped out of the woods and looked directly at me, and was directly in front of me. It was covered in black fur, and it stood a good 6 to 7 feet tall. Only moving my eyes, I started at the feet of this thing and looked up. This thing's feet were huge. They looked like gorilla feet. Its legs were covered in nasty black fur, and as I continued to look up, I noticed its abdominal area was fur-free. You could see its skin, which almost looked like leather. Its chest was also bare. Its arms hung down by its sides, and the only part of its hands that weren't covered in fur were the underside of its palms and fingers. Its hands were slightly bent like a gorilla might, as they hung by its side. Going on up, its face also seemed gorilla-like. It had a huge nose, just like a gorilla, ears like a gorilla, and a slightly cone-shaped head. Its eyes were brown, but its teeth were actually what scared me. It had 4 large, almost canine-like teeth, which you could clearly see. 2 in the upper gum, and 2 in the lower. This thing just stood there, looking at me, and then it took a step towards me. The only thing I could do was squeeze my eyes shut, waiting to die. As I stood there, I could feel this thing's hot breath on me, and the sound of it sniffing me. I just knew that I was gonna die, and it was only after I couldn't feel its breath anymore, or hear that sniffing, that I decided to slowly open my eyes. It was gone, but I could hear this thing crunching through the woods. It was just like in some scary movie. Needless to say, I didn't go to school that day. I turned around, went back in the house, locked myself in, and waited for my mother to get home. As far as my Dogman encounters go, here's the first one. It was during the summer months, and a buddy and I decided to go to Fall Creek Falls State Park to go hiking. We wanted to go camping there for the weekend. We'll call my buddy Brad. Brad was 23. I was 21. The weekend started off great. We arrived on a Friday night after both of us had got off work. It was kinda late, so we found a place to pitch the tent, and then we decided that we'd get started hiking first thing in the morning. The next day, we began our journey. It was nice and peaceful. I love nature, you see, so I was right at home. Then that night, we're relaxing and just talking like 2 buddies do by a campfire. We were in a secluded area, and there weren't any other campers around that we could hear. It was getting really late, so we climbed into our tent and went to sleep. Brad woke me up a couple hours later and told me he thought that there was a bear outside. As we lay there, staying very still, we could hear this thing's heavy footsteps, and what I think was breathing. Then, this thing seemed to get really close to the tent, and we could actually hear the breathing and the sniffing. This thing sounded like it had powerful lungs, with that deep, guttural growl. We could both feel this thing growl on our chest. We stayed perfectly still, hoping it wouldn't rip through the tent. And luckily, it didn't. But it did seem to stay in that area for a few minutes, sniffing, grunting, and making this growling noise. And then finally, thank God, we heard it walk off. The next morning, we managed to gather our courage and get out of the tent. And we could see clear tracks of some kind of large animal all around the tent. These tracks were big, and looked almost canine-like. But then Brad pointed something out to me. He showed me the tracks, and said whatever this thing was, looked like it was walking around on 2 legs. That was impossible. Right? That day, we started walking back to his truck, but we kept having the weirdest feeling that we were being watched and followed. Finally, we stopped for a minute to rest, and we heard that growl again, but it seemed much deeper, and very close. So we did the only thing that we could think of. We bolted. We ran as hard and as fast as we could. We could actually hear it behind us, chasing us, and we could hear the heavy footfalls in the woods behind us. After a few minutes, the sound was gone, but we weren't about to stop until we got back to the truck. That was the one and only time we ever went camping there. But it wasn't my one and only encounter with a dogman. My buddy Brad, same Brad as before, was riding out around with me, and he told me that he wanted to take me to this very isolated place that he found, where you can actually drive for over an hour and not see another car, another house, or even another human being the entire time. You could, however, see plenty of deer, and he was going to this place to hunt. So, we went and rode around, and he was right. We didn't see another car the entire time. Now, at the end of this long road, there's this old boat ramp and this small fishing area, even though it doesn't look like it's been used in a while. While we were there, we heard this horrible howl, scream combination. It wasn't a coyote. I know that. They're in this area, and I can identify their calls. Whatever this was, sounded a lot bigger than a coyote. We jumped in the truck and took off. He and I both started freaking out, as we couldn't believe that one of those creatures was this far from Fall Creek Falls. Little did we know, these creatures are everywhere. And then, this large creature ran out into the road. Brad hit the brakes. This thing just stood there on two legs. Its legs looked like a dog's. It was standing on its toes. It had black fur, almost identical to the Bigfoot that I saw. Its arms were slightly longer than a human's, and it had long claws at the end of each finger. It had canine-like ears and a muscular chest, but it was the face that creeped me out the most. It had a muzzle like a German Shepherd, and a head just like one too. It showed its teeth and growled, and even being in the truck, we could feel the growl. Its eyes were almost a yellow-amber color. Brad floored the truck and hit it straight for this thing. But whatever it was, dropped to all fours and jumped clear over the truck. We didn't stop until we got out of there. Eventually, Brad decided that he wanted to go back and look for this thing and hunt it down, even though I begged him not to. Brad's still missing, and the case is cold. It's been too long now for him to be alive somewhere. I believe Dogman is a government-created weapon. What do you think, Supernaturalist? Dakota. My name is Leonardo. I'd prefer to just leave it at that. No last name. I saw something I don't have a name for, other than a big, giant bat. I guess you could say I saw a cryptid if you want. I don't know what else to call it. I'm 27 years old, work at a shipping yard, and live a normal life. What I saw out during our camping trip that year was anything but normal. This happened in 2013, in Baxter State Park in Maine. It was during the summer, and it was supposed to just be a normal, everyday camping trip with my family and friends. We used to go there every year, but now, we haven't been there since this happened. I'm writing to you on May 28, 2020. That makes it coming up on 7 years since we've been out there on that camping trip. I've been out there since, but haven't stayed overnight. I haven't seen anything like that creature again either. There were 8 people there when it happened. We all saw it. Every one of us. Even the kids. I was there with my girlfriend Carissa, my brother Giovanni and his wife Jeanette, and their 2 kids. I'll leave their names out of it. We also had our family friends Steve and Crystal there, and we had Steve's dog Goose there with us too. Goose was the one that gave us the first warning sign that something was up. If it was just me that saw it, I'd say it might have been my imagination, but since all of us saw it, I think it's safe to say it wasn't a hallucination. Right before shit hit the fan, we were all just sitting around the campfire talking and laughing. My niece and nephew, who were 10 and 9 at the time, got to stay up late because it was a special occasion. We'd been doing this camping trip before they were born, and this was the first year that they were both allowed to stay up that late, so it was an important thing to them. Anyways, we were all just there having a good time, when Goose started acting weird. He started whining at first, and looking up towards this one specific tree. He'd get up, give a little growl, and then go to Steve and put his head in his lap. Then he'd walk around the outside of our little circle, whine again and lay down. And he must have done this half a dozen times. After that, things started to get even weirder. I guess the first thing that seemed weird, looking back on it now, was that we started hearing this clicking sound above our heads. It sounded like 4 or 5 clicks would sound off every 20 seconds or so. At first it was kind of quiet, but as it progressed, the noise got a little louder. Weirder still was that it sounded like it was coming from the direction of the tree that Goose was so interested in. Jeanette actually hushed all of us and told us to listen after she started hearing it. All of us just sat there in silence as we listened for this click. It was weird, I have to admit that. The second thing that happened was this weird smell started coming through where we were sitting. Carissa was actually the first person to notice that, and she asked everyone about it. I told her I could smell it, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was that I was smelling. At this point, the niece and nephew were getting a little scared, and were cuddling up with their parents, but the niece actually pinpointed what it was that we were smelling. She said it smelled like the pool that she would go swimming in. What she meant was the chlorine. After she said that, it clicked. That's what I was smelling. After I researched that, people call that smell ozone, and I guess it's a thing during paranormal encounters sometimes. After that, we started hearing this rustling noise in the tree that Goose loved so much. It sounded like something moving around on one of the limbs, and you could hear something scraping on the bark. This sent the niece and nephew into panic, but Jeanette was doing what she could to keep them calm. She told them it was just a raccoon or something like that. It seemed to calm them down a little bit, but whatever it was kept shifting around, like it was walking back and forth on the branch. If you'd ever been in a forest in Maine, you'll know just how dark it gets out there. Our fire was the only thing lighting up the night, so naturally we needed to get our flashlights out and shine it at the tree to scare whatever it was off, so the kids wouldn't be scared anymore. Leave it to us three boys to be the ones to piss off this giant bat from hell, right? So we shine our lights into the tree, and it took a good couple seconds to pinpoint where it was actually coming from. All I know is I saw something that was tan-colored moving around in the leaves before all hell broke loose in that campsite. First thing that happened after our lights hit this thing was I heard this loud screeching sound, almost like a pig squealing, but higher pitched. The area in the tree where this thing was perched started exploding, leaves flying everywhere and branches shaking. There was more shrieking, and the kids started screaming too. Then, this monster-sized bat thing burst out of them and starts flying around our camp. Here's what this thing looked like to me. A giant bat, but with no fur on it at all. It was tan-colored, and had big wings that looked like a bat's, the way the skin is stretched between the fingers. It had big, pointy ears on the sides of its head, and a pointed nose with a big mouth. I didn't see the teeth, but Giovanni swears it had teeth like a vampire. Long, pointed canines. Its front legs were the wings, and it didn't have any other front legs around that area that I could see, but it did have back legs that had claws on them. I'm guessing those claws were to catch prey, and also to hold onto tree branches, which could explain the scraping noises that we were hearing in the tree. I'd guess if it was standing on the ground, it'd be about 2 feet tall, maybe a little more, and the wingspan about 4 feet long. I have no idea how much it could have weighed. This thing swooped around the area we were in, and screeched again. I could feel the wind it made when it flapped its wings. There was dust, dirt, and leaves that flew up off the ground when it flapped. It did a complete circle around where we were sitting, and then it flew up above our heads. At this point, as soon as that thing burst out of the tree, the scene turned into absolute chaos. The kids, Jeanette and Carissa, were screaming their heads off. Jeanette kept screaming profanities as she waved her hand around the tops of the kids' heads. Goose was going nuts too. He was barking and growling as Steve was tugging at his leash. We were all trying to get to the trailer that Gio brought. The chairs were all knocked over, food and drinks were all over the ground. Everything was complete hysteria. Gio and Jeanette scooped up the kids and carried them into the trailer, as all of us tried to get in too. Naturally, yours truly was the last one to get in, but finally, all 8 of us were in their tiny trailer, but Goose was still going nuts. He was scratching at the door, and barking and whining. The kids were crying, Carissa was crying, the whole scene was just chaos. Even after we got into that trailer, and we knew we were safe, everyone was still hysterical. We were all asking each other what the hell we had just seen. We didn't know what it was, just a really big bat it looked like. But to me, Hell, it could have even been a monster, or something else. Jeanette said it was a demon, but no one really gave any thought to that theory. Steve said it was a gargoyle, but nobody listened to that either. Everyone was pretty much just arguing about what it could be. Then we heard this thump on the roof of the trailer, and it sounded like something walking around on top of it. There was this clicking sound again. I guarantee you, it was made from that damn creature. Crystal started crying at this point, and said it was going to get in. Then Jeanette snapped at Crystal for saying that in front of the kids, who obviously were still scared out of their minds. It was a fun time to be in that trailer, let me tell you that much. Steve said we needed to go out there and shoot it, and luckily, Gio made us put the guns that we brought in the little lockbox he kept under the bed in the trailer, so we didn't even have to go to our tents to get the guns. We grabbed those guns and ran out of the trailer, yelling at this thing, waving our hands, being loud, trying to look big, trying to scare this thing off. Whatever it was, flew off before we could get a clear shot, so we didn't actually end up firing on it at all. Which I guess is a good thing, right? What if we missed and that bullet hurt somebody else? All 8 of us, and the dog, ended up sleeping in the trailer that night. I'd be damned if I stayed in my tent and that thing came back. We felt safer being in something sturdy like that trailer, even if it was so cramped. All night long, though, Goose was still restless. He'd get up and whine, scratch at the door, start growling, so that made all of us think that that thing was still out there somewhere. We didn't hear those clicking noises again, and nothing was on top of the trailer, but none of us went back out there again. The one thing that made me smile that night was that my nephew wanted to curl up with his Uncle Leo, because it made him feel safe. The niece was already curled up with Gio, so I didn't feel bad taking some of his thunder. It just made me smile knowing that the boy thought his uncle was cool enough to protect him from some monster out there with wings. Whatever it was, I haven't seen again, but you can be damn sure we packed up and left the next day. I still, to this day, have no idea what it was that we saw. All my research comes up blank. Have you ever heard of something like this before? I don't know of any other sightings in the area, but some people might not want to share what they saw. I know it took a long time for us to say anything. What do you think it was, Supernaturalist? There is this one thing that I researched and I found called a fangolobolo. It looks like a big bat to me too, but this thing lives in Madagascar, so unless this fangolobolo thing packed up its bags and moved over to the States, I doubt it was the same thing. But maybe it could have even been something that's similar to this. Some unknown cryptid that looks like a bat, but is actually something else. Or hell, maybe we found the first bat of its species up in Maine. If we did, does that mean that I get to name it? I'll have to think of something cool for that. Until then, though, I'm gonna go ahead and classify this thing as an unknown cryptid, and let my boy, the Supernaturalist, do what he does best and figure out what it was that we saw that night. I hope everybody listening has a good night, and maybe one of you can tell me what it was that I saw. Leo, in Maine. I am currently a resident of Altoona, Pennsylvania. I'm writing this to report a strange encounter I experienced with a friend of mine in the early morning hours of Sunday, March 17th of 2013. I chose not to report this event prior to now due to an unwillingness to expose myself, or my family and friends. I didn't want the public scrutiny. In light of recent spates of similar sightings in central Pennsylvania, I have changed my mind on the matter. Perhaps our experience will help with the current research. As such, I would like to make my intention clear that myself and any persons mentioned, please remain anonymous. Reporting a Bigfoot or even a UFO sighting is one thing, but this is somewhat different. On the evening in question, a friend and I were returning from a job that I had performed in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania. My friend was driving. To the best of my recollection, the incident occurred somewhere between 1:30 a.m. and 2 o'clock a.m. on the morning of March 17th. We were traveling southwest on Route 22 through a suburb of Holidayburg, Pennsylvania. As we rounded a little curve in the road, our attention was drawn to our left on the opposite side of the road. There, in a standing or squatting position, in a clearing a few feet off the side of the road, was some kind of creature. My friend wasn't driving very fast, and slowed a bit as we approached it. Our initial view of it was from a dorsal side, as it was facing away from us. It came into profile as we passed with its right side to us. It struck me immediately that the creature had a combination of both man and canine features. It was squatting down on its hind legs close to the ground, but it was doing so in a bipedal fashion. The legs had the stifle joint and hop characteristics of a canine, not like a human leg. It had its front limbs or arms in front of it, and I believe it was possibly crouched over something, maybe a smaller animal. The arms were long in proportion to its body. I recall thinking the hands were more human-like as opposed to paws. Its torso seemed to be somewhat hunched forward. I had the impression that at any moment it could have gone to all fours quite comfortably. The creature's chest was not broad like a human's, but had a pronounced forward-angle breastbone like a canid. It gave an impression of great strength, having distinct and well-defined musculature, but was not built on a massive frame. It seemed more thin and sinewy. If it had stood fully erect, I would estimate that the creature would have been close to 7 feet tall. It was covered in fur that was grayish-silver in color. The creature seemed unnaturally shiny, although this could have been a reflection from the headlights or even the moon. It had pointy, erect canine ears that were somewhat laid back on its head. The head was large and very wolf-like in overall appearance. The muzzle was also very wolf-like, although the snout wasn't exceptionally elongated. It had canine-like teeth. To the best of my recollection, the eyes were an amberish color, but may have had a reddish glow or reflection to them. It had a wolf-like tail, too. It turned its head to watch us, and tracked us as we passed. It seemed quite aware of our presence. My friend and I continued in stunned silence for a few moments. When the creature was no longer in view, I turned and asked my friend what we had just seen. "We just saw a werewolf," were his exact words. I agreed that was pretty much my own assessment. I asked if he could turn the car around, but he absolutely refused to do so. We spent the rest of our trip debating as to whether it could have been a dog or even someone's escaped pet wolf. But to be honest, it just wasn't. I'm sure of that. Both my friend and I are experienced outdoorsmen, and neither of us have ever seen anything fitting that description before. I was actually raised not far from the area, and I know it quite well. Anonymous. I'm from the UK, and I was wondering if anyone has any idea what this might have been that I saw. I was young at the time, about 11 years old, and I was taking a walk into the woods with a good friend of mine, who I still know to this day. At the time, I lived in a small village in the south of England. My friend lived in the village next to mine, and I was over hers for the day. She lived in an old-style Victorian house, which was separated from the rest of the village by a woodland area about 2 miles deep. They were, and still are, quite posh and pretty well off. There was a small country road that went around the side of the woodlands and connected their house to the village, but when walking, we always cut through the woods, as it was much faster. Right at the edge of the woods, before the rest of the village, was a lovely yard where there were lots of horses that we used to go and sneak apples to and pet, and that day, we were on our way to do this. Once we reached around the halfway point through the woods, there was a small clearing in the trees. We stopped to use a rope swing on the edge of this clearing. My friend was pushing me on the rope swing when we heard something in the woods howl. I remember distinctly the fact that it didn't sound like a regular dog howl. I've grown up in a family with lots of large dogs, and it just didn't sound quite the same. It sounds silly, but it just didn't sound right. Normally, I wouldn't take much notice, and I would pass it off as someone out walking their dog. But I looked at my friend, and she looked nervous and frozen in place, too. It's that sort of moment when your instincts are trying to figure out whether there's a real threat or not. I don't really know how to describe it, but it just sounded too perfect. almost like it was a fake sound effect being played. We don't have any wolves or anything similar in the UK, so it had to have been a pet dog, but it just howled once perfectly, and then it stopped. There was nothing. No barking, no other howls, not even the sound of any movement in the woods. It was just dead silence. After a few seconds without talking, we sort of both silently agreed to get a move on and not delay any further. We walked onwards without talking. A while later, with about a quarter of the way left to go, my friend stopped suddenly in front of me and pointed at the trees in the distance in front of us. I looked and could see in the distance something that looked like a wolf, but so much bigger, and it was standing and staring right at us. It was a little way away, so I don't exactly have any specifics, but it was at least as tall as my 11-year-old self. Each paw was planted firmly on the ground. It had dark, shaggy brown hair, and its body was positioned directly at us. Its ears were up, and I remember vividly it had yellow-amber eyes. I know domestic dogs can have light brown eyes that look kind of orangey, but I've never seen one with yellow eyes, which is something that always has stuck with me. We were sort of stuck there for a while, looking at it, until it eventually backed off into the woods. I remember it didn't turn around and walk away. It walked slowly backwards in a sort of unnatural, uncomfortable way until it was out of our view. It just struck me as odd. We obviously weren't a threat to it. It was massive. It also apparently decided it really didn't want anything to do with us, as it wasn't coming after us. Normally, if a dog isn't interested in a toy, it would just turn around and walk away. But this thing just backed off, unnaturally, like it didn't know what it should be doing. After that, we ran back in the direction that we'd come from, all the way back to her home. We were much closer to the village, but at that point, there was no way we were going in the direction that the wolf thing disappeared into. It could have been a normal dog, I guess, but this thing was massive. It had bright yellow eyes. There was no owner in sight. Even if it was a massive yellow-eyed stray dog, these sorts of things don't really go unnoticed. Where I'm from, it's not like America, where there's lots of open spaces. Here in England, you're never more than a couple miles away from somewhere inhabited, and people are always walking through the countryside. So surely, anything living should have been caught at some point, or at least been made aware of. As well as things like wolves, they just don't simply live in the UK, so that couldn't be a possibility, even though this thing was much bigger than any normal dog that I'd ever seen. If anyone has experienced something similar, or has any sort of explanation as to what was going on, that would be great. Thank you, and good night. In December of 2006, my family and I moved into a new house. Well, new for us. It was an older house, to be honest. I'm the head of the household. I have a wife and 3 small children. At the time, we thought we were really lucky to find such an awesome deal. It was 2,800 square feet, and it was a house in the woods with no neighbors, and it was $1,000 a month. I was a successful car salesman at the time, and my wife was and still is a nurse. We thought the house was great, but after moving in, I noticed something very odd. There'd been a padlock on the door of the basement that'd been removed, but you could still see the screw holes in the door and on the frame where it had been. The strange thing is, afterwards I felt like something was waiting for me to notice that, because after I did, that's when weird things started to happen. The house was a bi-level house, with half of the house being a 2-story house, and the other half being 1 story. The part of the house that was bi-level had the bedrooms on the 2nd floor. The other half had the living room, dining room, and kitchen. One night, after putting our kids to bed upstairs, my wife and I were watching TV in the living room. About an hour or so after the kids were asleep, my 4-year-old son came running down the stairs, terrified and screaming. After I got him calmed down, he told me there was something in his room that kept grabbing him and was trying to pull him off his bed by his ankles. When he said it, it made the hair on my neck stand up. I calmed him down and got him to go back to sleep by laying in his room with him. A few hours after that, my wife and I were in bed, and were awoken by a blood-curdling scream coming from our 2-year-old daughter's room. When we went to our room, she was sitting straight up on her bed, screaming at the top of her lungs with her eyes closed. There was nothing we could do to get her to stop. We both tried holding her and coddling her, but it didn't work. We tried to wake her up, and that wouldn't work either. Finally, after about 10 minutes, she just laid down and was silent again. After this, nothing notable happened until spring. I'm a smoker, and there was a decent deck on the back of the house that I took to smoking on. One warm spring night, I was standing on the back deck smoking a cigarette when I heard something coming through the woods. Now, it wasn't uncommon to hear deer and other small animals scurrying about in the forest, but there was something much different to this, and it sounded like it was coming directly at me. As it grew louder, I knew it was coming directly at me, and it also sounded like it was walking on two legs. I've lived in the woods most of my life, and I can tell when something is walking on two legs or four. From the deck, the edge of the woods was about 25 to 30 feet away. Whatever this was, walked all the way to the edge of the woods and just stopped. As I squinted to try to see if I could see anything, whatever it was began to pace back and forth, and I was absolutely sure that it was watching me. I called out, "I own a gun," but it didn't even stop for a second. It had a slow, methodical walk as it paced back and forth. This was in stark contrast to when it was walking towards me, which was a more purposeful walk. I quickly went inside and turned the lights out and looked through the window to see if I could see anything, but I couldn't. By the next morning, I had convinced myself that it was a deer and that I'd just given myself the willies because I was alone out there. But then it happened that night, and the night after, and it only happened after everyone else was in bed and I was outside smoking by myself. Then it got worse. After a few nights, it didn't scare me anymore, because it would walk to the edge of the forest and then stalk back and forth. I got to where I would finish my cigarette and then give it the finger and go back inside the house. One night, I was outside smoking, and it came as always, and started stalking as always, and I just stood there and stared in its direction the whole time. I consider myself a decent-sized guy, and I'm not scared easily, so I decided to stand my ground. Whatever this thing was, must have sensed this, because it stopped and made the strangest sound at me. I know what a deer grunt is, and I know what snorts sound like. It wasn't either of those. It wasn't a large cat or dog, or any other animal I can think of. It was this low, guttural, evil growl. That doesn't even do it justice, describing it like that. It was something I'd never heard before, that's for sure. And it definitely scared me so bad that before I knew it, I was on the back of the other side of the door, looking back out of the window. After that, I would smoke in the garage or with my hand sticking out of the door. But even after a couple of weeks of this, I'd convinced myself once again that I'd just given myself the willies, and there was really nothing to be afraid of. So, one night, I went outside to smoke again. Not long after I went outside, I heard it come from two different directions this time. One came at me from my left. One came at me from directly in front of me. The rest of what happened to me happened so fast that I'm really going to try to explain it the best that I can. Once these two entities walked to the edge of the woods, I saw a blur of white go from my right to my left, right in front of me. Then, from the corner of my eye, there was something standing there at first. I believed it was a deer, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there at all. Then from the woods, I heard a horrible, terrifying scream. That made me run back into the house. I didn't go out there to smoke ever again after that. A few nights later, I was awoken to the sound of our bedroom door rattling. We'd sleep with our door open and the hallway light on, just in case one of the kids had to get up to go to the bathroom. As I was waking up, my first thought was one of the kids was playing with the door, because as I was opening my eyes, I could see someone in the doorway that was about 3 feet tall. I opened my eyes wide to tell them to go back to bed, but there was nobody there. After that, I decided to move my family out of that house, and we were actually sued by the landlord because we broke our lease early. If anyone can help with what happened there, I'd greatly appreciate it, because it's bugged me ever since. Thank you. I used to work at a cheese factory on the edge of a cornfield in southwestern Minnesota. There were a series of days in the summer of 2004 where it was so hot that the milk being delivered to us in the trucks would evaporate before we even got it. It made work easy. There wasn't any actual labor, but management wouldn't let us stay home. So we had to show up, and we would just mess around. I was working nights at the time during this particular event, and it was about 2 or 3 a.m. I was out on the loading docks watching bats fly around the floodlights because I liked being out in the cool night air. The corn was about as high as my shoulder, so about 5 foot 10 inches, and as I was watching the bats, I looked down at the edge of the cornfield and saw something was moving there. It was the size of a small child, and very, very skinny. It was pale, with something that looked like straight black hair. It moved in a sort of jerky gait, like someone dancing the robot, but dancing it badly. It moved in chunks, legs, then hips, and torso, shoulders, neck, and finally the head. It was looking back into the cornfield, or at least I felt like it was looking back into the cornfield, and it made me feel prickly all over. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was a heron at first, or something like that, but it just looked too much like a person. It didn't move like a person though. Gradually, step by step. And then eventually, it started moving towards me. Letting my curiosity better my fear, I moved towards the edge of the dock, which was raised a few feet off the ground so it could connect with the semis. When I got within a few feet of the edge, that thing looked right at me, and all of a sudden, I was paralyzed. I could have run, but I was stuck somewhere between terrified and intrigued. It moved its face, still pointed at me, and then it ratcheted its body in that disturbing, jerky movement towards the cornfield and went back into it. I tried to watch where the field was moving, but the corn remained perfectly still. I also noticed that all the crickets were silent. After a few minutes, nothing happened, but I stood out there for over an hour. It never came back, and I never saw it again. I still have no idea what it is. Do you have any ideas? My story takes place in the year 2000. I was riding to high school with a friend in Cheshire, Massachusetts. We drove past the school and pulled into a driveway to turn around when a creature ran out of the woods and just stood there and stared at us for like 5 minutes. It looked a lot like a lemur, with a long, skinny striped tail that it held straight up. It had a face that I would describe as a cross between an armadillo and a wild boar, yet smaller in size, if you can imagine that. What creeped me out even more than that lemur-like body, however, was the creepiest part of the creature's features. Its face had visible teeth. It had bottom fangs that must have been 4 to 5 inches long and curved upwards towards its creepy, squinty eyes. I don't know what more to say except that the creature's face looked evil. It did not have a normal animal expression. It was looking straight at us, and we felt lucky to be in the car because this thing looked menacing. If anyone knows anything about this strange creature that we described, please comment in the comments below. The creature I saw stood there until we began to back out of the driveway, and then it turned and ran back into the woods. However, it did repeatedly look back over its shoulder until finally disappearing into the woods. I've never seen a creature like this before, or since, but I sure wish I knew what it was that I saw. I saw something that I can't even begin to try to figure out what it was. I'm hoping you or one of your viewers can help me solve this mystery that's been nagging at me for the last 5 years, because I'm at a loss. Everyone I talk to tells me I'm making it up, or I'm exaggerating what this thing looked like. But I promise you, I'm not exaggerating anything. I live in Louisiana with my girlfriend and brother. We live in a little parish where there's not a lot to do, so sometimes we just drive the back roads and have a lot of fun. There's a couple little bars there in the parish, but that's not my thing. I watched a good friend of mine drink himself to death, so I don't drink myself, and I've never done drugs either. This one night, all three of us are in my truck, and we're just cruising around like normal. It was about 11 o'clock at night, and the only lights out on the dirt road were my headlights and the stars and the moon. The moon was almost full, so it helped illuminate the roads a little bit. And the only person that was drinking was my brother. Me and my girlfriend were stone sober, and all three of us saw this shit. So we'd been driving for about 30 minutes, and we're about 50 miles from our own parish. Sometimes, on nights like this, we'd just drive up and down the same roads a few times, and just take in the cool night air. So, we'd already driven down this exact road once already that night. We were going about 50 miles an hour, and all of a sudden, the lights hit something that I just don't have a name for. It was hunched over in the middle of the dirt road, eating something that looked like a big dog, but it was all ripped apart. I mean, blood and guts all out. At first, it was hunched over and we could see the side of it, but when my lights hit it, this thing looked up at us and pivoted its body to confront us. I damn near shit my britches because it looked like something straight out of a scary movie. It was man-size, but slender. I'm talking tall and skinny. Its skin was shock white. You could almost see through it, I felt. It had these long, skinny arms that had what I guess were claws on them. Maybe just long fingernails. Both hands were covered in blood, so I can't guess for certain. It was completely hairless, even on the top of its head. No hair at all. Bald as a cue ball. I didn't see no ears or a nose, just big black eyes and a big wide mouth that was covered in blood. In fact, half its face was covered in blood. Its eyes looked like a shark's do, black and soulless, and its mouth looked like it was all sharp teeth. It was the most evil, scariest thing that I could ever imagine, and it was right in front of us. It looked at us with the most evil, hate-filled expression that I'd ever seen, and it screamed out at us. The scream sounded like a cougar almost, and I slammed on my brakes since it was right in the middle of the road. As I slammed on my brakes, though, this thing pushes up with its arms off the ground, flies up in the air, and lands on its feet, and then it darts off into the darkness and into the brush on the side of the road. It moved so fast that I couldn't even brake before it was gone, so I just sped the hell back up and kept going. The whole time, my girl is screaming her head off, and me and my brother were cussing up a storm. He was yelling at me to get the hell out of there, and I was yelling at him that I was. We were calling each other names and yelling over the top of my girl's head. She was crying and freaking out, kept asking what the hell we'd just seen, but to this day I still don't have an answer for her. Whatever this thing was, it looked wild and mean, but it also looked calculated and smart. It was faster than anything I'd ever seen in my entire life. Obviously it was a carnivore, and I believe it was something supernatural. We haven't been out there since, but I do know some folks that live in that parish. They haven't seen anything like that around there. I don't know if it was just passing through, or if it can move through dimensions, or if it's from another planet. Any ideas would help me out a ton. Nobody I've talked to has had an encounter with it. I know when we were emailing you wanted me to check, but I come up empty-handed. So hopefully, somebody that's listening to this video can shed some light on what the hell it was that we saw that night. Because I know I'll sure as hell never forget it.